appreciate being here tonight. You're probably wondering why I chose to start with a question mark on the screen behind me. Today I thought that you can see my work online and I can show you my projects, and I will, but more important than just showing you my projects, I want to explain to you why we're doing what we're doing, which I think is a much more interesting story and a much more interesting reasons behind this cross-disciplinary approach to design. I started the practice in New York are we okay with this mic? I started my practice in New York in 2003, where I graduated from a product design program in Eindhoven in the Design Academy. My interest was always to be a cross-disciplinary designer, and at first I didn't really know what it means. I knew that it's doing a lot of different things, and I assumed that I'll be a specialist in a lot of different things. Very quickly I realized that I'm not a specialist, and that it's quite hard to be a specialist in a lot of different types of design. So I started thinking, am I a generalist? And can a generalist be ever specialist? And can my project be good enough in different disciplines and in different areas? I'm going to have some slides running in the background while I give you the introduction, but don't worry, I'll go through some of those things. Can you adjust it? One of the things that I realized very early on is that I'm interested in innovation, and that I'm interested in innovation across multiple disciplines and in different various of scales. When I realized that design have a lot of different specialists, a lot of different professions that call themselves specialists, I realized that I need to constantly work with different people that are specialists and are best in what they do in order to achieve a lot of different results. So when I realized that it's very important to not compromise, I realized that every design that we do, from small to very large, is always about the collaboration. It's always about the collaborations, and ideally with the collaboration with people that reference their work in the same way that we reference our work. We are interested in innovation, we're interested in pushing boundaries, we're interested in doing things that are improving people's well-being, we're interested in things that provoke thoughts, provoke ideas, provoke new standards, and actually usually raise a question. So starting with the question is not a coincidence. I find very often that what we do when we get a brief from a client is we actually ask a lot of questions. We don't give answers right away, and sometimes we don't give answers at all. Sometimes the questions are actually provoking something a lot more interesting. When I moved to New York, I started with this product that for me really identify my first experience in the city. It really identified one, this idea of being naive, this idea of being pure and going to the big city and trying to do something in more professional way. So when I started, it was more about a metaphorical experience that I wanted to take a vase through and actually show that the experience is the beauty that who we are brings us to, brings us through the experience that we took in our life. So when I showed this vase to Rosenthal, they said, we've been perfecting porcelain for 125 years. Here you come and you actually break it. And you show the highlight and you show the beauty in the imperfection. One of the things that we realized specifically in this vase is that porcelain in white and porcelain in black have a very, very, very different feeling. One is extremely pure and naive in many ways, and the black one is more strong, sexy, and this contrast start building this idea of duality, this idea of juxtaposition, that actually everything that I call transformation always have that. So this is example what I call a metaphorical transformation, and this is probably the best example to describe what a physical transformation is, where a chair can actually become an art piece. So you're thinking about a folding chair, and you're thinking about the idea that a folding chair is a chair that I'm not proud of because I'm hiding it. But when guests are coming to visit, I pull it out because I don't have enough chairs. So what's the idea? I'm actually, cleaning the house, making a nice dinner, and then I'm letting my guests sit on the ugliest chair that I'm not even proud to put in my environment when they're not there. So instead of having that, I was thinking that what if the most important piece in my environment, my art, can become the piece that they're sitting on. So once we realized that all we created is a canvas with hinges, all we created is a very simple form that goes from two-dimensional to three-dimensional. Two-dimensional is art when I don't need it, and three-dimensional with a function when I do need it. So we started inviting different artists and done different collaborations and basically let the artists do their own interpretation. So we actually created a design canvas. And very often I like this word design canvas because it refers to the fact that it doesn't end with us. It doesn't end where we finish the project. Sometimes it's actually just a start for something else. So those two examples really for me are the easiest way to explain the difference between metaphorical transformation and physical transformation. Very often I refer to those two things as the fact that we as a human being are transformable being. Sometimes we are physically transforming, and sometimes we're emotionally transforming. And those ideas of transformation are very much key in our life today. We constantly want different things. We constantly desire different things. This is the first project I've done for Capellini, and this is a project that really started with the idea of what is strength? What strength mean? Sometimes you're thinking emotionally about yourself and you're saying, I need to build a wall, I need to be strong, I need to, not be weak. And sometimes you're saying, no, I want to be vulnerable. I want to be comfortable, and comfortable means being yourself and not building walls. So I started thinking about a peacock, and the idea that peacock opens up his feather for completely two different reasons. One is to say, I'm attractive, I'm big, see how beautiful my wings are. And sometimes you say, well, stay away. I'm big and large, and you should not come close to me. So this idea really inspired me to think about this shape, and to think about how can I use 3 sheets of folds that have no structural integrity to hold a person, but just by the way that they position together, they can actually hold a person. So we were very lucky that Rihanna decided to sit on our chair. Because in the first week she got about 40 million hits, and you can't get that many hits as a designer alone. So it's funny, at the same time that this was on Rihanna's video, it also got accepted to the permanent collection of the Metropolitan, which at that time, you can say, well, this is the best achievement you can have as a designer, but 300,000 visitors a year versus 40 million people. You do the math, what's more important? Architecture has been something to... No, okay, stay with that. So I'm going to sing at the end a little bit. Architecture interests me for quite some time, and I was wondering, when people say your work is very architectural, I didn't really understand what they meant, because I never went to architectural school. I never thought about architecture in the same way that I probably think about it today. But I like the idea that design have no boundaries. I like the idea that there's no places where I say, well, this is a discipline that I'm not interested in because, that's too big of a scale, or that's a different type of approach, or things like that. So this is a project that is very dear to my heart because it's pretty much my first idea in architecture. My first idea when somebody says, why don't you start thinking about larger scale? I sat in front of my sketchbook and I drew an A-frame house. And I was wondering, why does every kid that I know is drawing a house like that? What is this shape? What is the importance of a pitched roof? So, you know, you go to the textbook and you realize that a pitched roof have a very importance and very easy for snow loads and different weather conditions that it's beneficial for. But you're thinking about places like New York and like Toronto, where we have a very, very cold winter, but at the same time, very hot summer. So what if I could actually change this icon, and not just change the icon for the sake of changing the icon, but changing it and changing the program. So this is a very simple idea. It's basically a pitched roof that have two hydraulic systems, like a garbage truck, basically. So this idea of kind of pitching the roof back, this idea of actually lowering it by using two hydraulic pistons, I came to realize that the summer sun is much different than the winter sun. The winter sun is much lower, the summer sun is much higher, and you can actually use this system not just to change the program of your house, but you can also change it to actually react ecologically. So during the summer, the house is shaded from the sun, and during the winter, you're actually collecting the sun. So it's both a system that is beneficial from that regard, but also changing your structure. In 2007, something very interesting happened. We got a client. We got a client that came to the studio and said, we have 135,000 square feet of land in Abu Dhabi, and we want you to think about top luxury residential. We want you to think about how luxury can be at the very max. And I was wondering, 135,000 square meter of land, you want to build 65 villas. Why would anybody that have that much money don't want to just buy the island and live there alone? Why would they live with 50 neighbors from the left and 35 neighbors from the right? So this idea that luxury in this particular setting is about privacy. This idea that when I was thinking about the Persian Gulf, all that I knew of the Persian Gulf is carpet making. So I remember this saying that whatever we don't want to see, we just tuck and shove underneath the carpet. So what if the entire island, the entire program, the entire architecture of this island is basically done like a carpet, where all the vegetation is covering the entire villas, covering basically all the structure. So when you are standing on the roof of a house, you don't see any houses. You don't see any structures. You just see greenery. Very quickly, we realized that it's not just an interesting idea conceptually, it's also extremely beneficial for the sun of Abu Dhabi, that actually greenery shades the houses, and actually it's very smart to use the gray water of the houses and water those vegetation. So it actually became also a very interesting green approach. When we sent our idea to Abu Dhabi, they basically first commissioned us to come up with an idea. They first commissioned us to do a concept. When they commissioned us to do a concept, I did not really think about how were we going to build those houses, how are they exactly constructed. They gave us a call back after we sent the presentation and said, we love it, we want to build it. We are going to execute this. And I started laughing on the phone. I said, I have no idea how to construct this. I have no idea how to build this. And they said the smartest thing I've heard from a client at that time. They said, we know. We've done our homework on the size of your team, and we know that you've never done a project of that scale. So we need to pad you with the knowledge that you're lacking. And we actually need to bring all the consultants and all the specialists that would allow you to create this vision. And that was, for me, the first time that I realized the power of design. The power of actually doing something that you have an idea about, you don't necessarily know how to execute it, but you can find the knowledge, and you can find the team to do it with. This is a project of a $1.2 billion in construction budget, and it's our first completed project in architecture. When this project came to the market in May of 2008, I was in New York, and I heard, and we said, you know, every house that will be sold will open a bottle of champagne. That was something that we said kind of when we sent all the drawings out. We didn't hear from the marketing team for about 3 days, and we were like, what is going on there? They called us back and said, guys, everything sold out in 72 hours. So they collected about $900 million of sale in 72 hours, and I always like to compare it to Avatar on its first weekend out and say that we did just a little bit better. So, you know, this is something that, for me, it really made me understand that design have no boundaries, and the design have no scale, and your education, your school education, let's call it like this, have a very particular influence on how you're moving forward in your career. Big part of my studio works on projects that nobody asks us to do, which is my way of actually thinking about ideas, keep on thinking about things that I'm interested in versus just, you know, who knocks on our door. This is something that happened completely by accident, and a very happy accident that happened in the workshop, which is an environment that I love using because it's a different tool to a computer. It's a different tool to explore materials. Actually, at that time, all that I wanted to create is this chandelier for Swarovski. And what I wanted to do is actually have two squares that are intersecting in one point and not have an internal square and an external square. So I started cutting different shapes of materials, and I started to realize that by using 4 identical shapes that are connected to one another in such a way that one side is connected to the opposite side, when you put it on a surface, it basically opens up and creates this triangulation. It can actually open up and support its own load, and actually more than that. So at first, I thought, what can you do with this? It's really interesting geometry. It have no hinge. It is actually a hinge without a pin, without the traditional joints. And it basically always parallel to the surface, so those forms can stack. First, we looked at it and we said, well, it looks like an acoustic form. Can it be walls? Can it be acoustic walls? Then we started to invite the knowledge. Then we start to invite different engineers and different people that actually contribute quite a lot to what we are lacking, the experience and the knowledge. So one of the things that we realize is that it's fantastic for an acoustic barrier walls because of the shape. It's completely deployable because it's one single mold made in a factory. You don't need to pour concrete on site. You can actually bring it on a flat truck, and because those pieces stack flat and open on space, they can actually be transported quite quickly. And one of the things that we realize is that this geometry is extremely strong. And actually, because it's triangulated in such a way that every side that have a V have the opposite side that have an A. So that's happening on all 4 sides. And actually, this form of concrete that you're seeing here can support 86 pieces of that size and that scale on top of it without crushing. Of course, it's going to move with the wind, but just in terms of demonstrating the idea of how much load can a piece like this have. So you're talking about 400 kilos times 86 that this piece can support, which is actually almost the same as if this would have been a solid block of concrete without any of this geometry. But in fact, only 20% of the material, so 80% saving. So we became a little bit obsessed, and we started creating a lot of experiments. Some of them resulted in art installations, some of them are pushing different ways in infrastructure, in the infrastructure world, in urban planning, in different kind of setting. And we've divided this system into 2 categories. One is the idea of barriers, and the other one is the idea of space trusses. Now, what is space trusses? It's basically exactly the same, but instead of being solid, it's hollowed. So small scale can be used for sawhorses for a table, for instance, like you saw before. And on a larger scale, it can be a frame for a house. So metal, wood, concrete, all kinds of forms that are using the same geometry are actually resulting in something extremely strong. So one of the things that we realize is that we have an interesting system that can be scaled. Now, how do we bring it to the market? How do we introduce it and actually start utilizing it? The ability to aggregate this form and create all kinds of adoration, all kinds of combinations, from small product again to large architecture, is something that was studied. So prefab homes, skyscrapers as well. In fact, anything that this kind of triangulation can be supported for. So one of the things that we realize is that we probably don't want to cover and work alone on this geometry for the rest of our career. We actually want to invite other architects and other designers to work with us to also envision their ways of working with this. So we're calling it an open platform that we curate and invite people to collaborate with us and partner with us. This is the last thing that I'm going to speak about, this project, which once we realized that it's extremely simple, inexpensive, strong, besides working with a certain type of client, can this be something that can help slums and favelas and those type of settings? So one of the things that we realize is that slums and favelas don't have many engineers validating those structures. So those structures are quite flimsy. They pretty much, if there's a strong wind or something else, you can lose the entire neighborhood. So one of the things that we've done here is actually, instead of providing houses, instead of saying, well, I think you should live inside of something like this, we said, well, let's create a joint, and only a joint system that can actually be used by local people to create whatever they can with whatever they have. So this idea of actually creating just a joint and everything else is coming from the local community, so they can keep on upgrading that. But that's just a couple of examples of things that we're working on, and we're calling it a call for collaboration. So different companies that thinks that that kind of structure is interesting for them, simply calling us, and we're finding ways of working with them. I'm going to end with one project that is very, very important for me on many levels. I think it's another kind of benchmark in our career, and it's something that I thought when we got the island project in Abu Dhabi that we worked on a large project. When we got this commission, we didn't really understand how small the island was. So I started with a vase, and I'm going to end with a city. This project was introduced to us by a developer in Turkey that proposed a very interesting idea to the city, for Turkey, for the country, but in particular to the city of Istanbul. He said, 500 years ago, Mimar Sinan had an idea of cutting an additional canal, basically creating an island. If you know the map of Istanbul, Istanbul have the Bosphorus cutting the city in two. One side is the European side, one side is the Asian side. And then the Black Sea on top and the Marmara Sea underneath. And that canal is used to transport basically anything between those two places, including a lot of hazardous material that are endangering the population on the Bosphorus, which is the main population of the city of Istanbul. So this idea of actually creating another canal that would cut Istanbul and create a certain island is what was proposed 500 years ago. Back then, they didn't have the technology to do it. So every 100 years, somebody else introduced that idea again. And then finally, this guy introduced the idea again, and the country is actually doing it. $40 billion of dredging land, approximately 1 billion cubic meter of land that is being dredged in a 46 kilometer of land. So this guy came to us and said, well, we don't know what to do with 1 billion cubic meter of land. Maybe you can think about a futuristic city that is somewhat an extension for Istanbul. And instead of being a 20th century that we live in, it's actually a 21st century that maybe think about all of the problems that we have right now with our cities and addressing them in a different way. So we said, well, here comes the developer that actually paying us to come up with an idea for a utopic city. That sounds wonderful. What we've done is a very ambitious idea. So don't ask me if it's going to happen or not, because I don't know. But this idea actually takes a lot of the problems that I see in our modern cities and actually think about them slightly different. I'm going to show you a quick video, but I'm going to quickly explain the logic behind it and maybe elaborate a little bit right after. One of the biggest issues that we have in cities right now is that we have an infrastructure and buildings. Structures that we live in and independent infrastructure from that. So you can say that the buildings are kind of selfish, right? They're basically plugged into a grid, they're taking the electricity and the water and whatever they need, and they basically throw back out everything that they don't need. They don't really communicate with the building next door, besides the fact that they're blocking the view and blocking the sun. So buildings are kind of selfish, and the infrastructure is just trying to keep on, loading those higher and higher rise to, cope with the network. And the network is old, so the pipes needs to get larger, and sometimes it's not possible. This idea is fundamentally about where infrastructure and structure can connect to one another and be one and actually support one another. So instead of doing tall skyscrapers on flat grid, instead of having two-dimensional grid and tall buildings, we're actually proposing to do a three-dimensional grid and horizontal buildings. And I'm going to let you watch this video. Thank you. So I can really talk about this project for a few more hours if you have time. But it's obviously it's a starting point, and it's something that is just a master plan, right? It's not that the entire island will be designed like that and designed with one kind of look. So the idea is that it's a grid that actually other designers and architects will create different, setting in and different houses and different kind of scenarios. But I think that, what's interesting for me is this idea that you can think about a lot of different problems in different scales. So let's go for a second from an island to an island. We just launched a collection, a brand actually named AVANI, which is positioned right here. Dave Marcus, which has been in the industry of kitchens for many years, came to my studio one day and said, I want to look at a market I have not been a part of yet, which is this growing market of high-rise, luxury residential. Those buildings are being built all over North America, and I want to find ways to create kitchens that are much better system than the existing one right now. So we basically, I always say, have two ways to identify a project that we want to do. One is if there's a willingness to be innovative, and two, if we like the people that we're working with. So we like Dave very much, and he had a very innovative challenge that was very interesting for me. One of the things that I find very, very annoying is that you always go to those different apartments and you see those kind of, cabinets in different sizes, and all of a sudden there's this kind of one cabinet that needed to be shorter than the other, or one panel that needed to be squeezed, or all kinds of strange things. And when I realize is that it's not the designer's problem, it's actually the system problem and a lot of other components, a lot of other things. Structural constraint, dimensional constraint, pipes, and all kinds of things like that. So one of the things that we realize is that we need to create a system that is very, 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 very simple and very, 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 very flexible. You have so many different conditions, so many different dimensions, so many relationship to windows and to structure and so forth and so forth. So what we've done is we first identified that the fridge is usually the first thing that you position in the kitchen because it's the biggest. And then it usually dictates how the kitchen flows. So very often you see that kitchens are not symmetrical. They have a kitchen here and then other appliances like that. And we said that if we can be symmetrical, if we can actually create something that have a very simple logic from both sides, we can start playing with dimensions that are constantly changing and scaling depending on the condition that we have. That's one. Second, this idea of having several frames, several moments where you can actually have different dimensions that have flexibility. So if you look at the example that we created here, you see that there are those gaps. Those gaps are basically allowing me to move, if I have 2 inches extra that I don't know what to do with, I don't need to create a cabinet that is 2 inches larger. I can actually just position it in the center. The second thing that we realize is that you always have kitchens against the wall. So when you start from the wall, and then if you have space, then you have an island. If you don't have space, you don't have an island. And that space is always a question of, can I afford a wide island, or can I just do something very, very small, or can I actually have a bar seating? And one of the things that we realize is that usually after that, your living room starts in most cases. So what we try to create is this scenario where the arc, the island can actually move and can actually be pushed all the way back if only space you have is just for the wall without an island. So let's say if you're entertaining and you're making dinner, or you're serving drinks and you want that extra space, you can bring it out. But also if you have an island, you can make it grow, and you can actually have more space for people to sit on, or actually move it further out and have an additional space. So very simple system, very simple proportion. The kitchen is an environment that for me is always the place where people gather all the time somehow, you know why. And it's something that I thought that there is so much clutter already in the kitchen. The most important thing for me is to actually make it simple and actually reduce the clutter. So, you know, we finish having dinner and now we don't want to clean all those dishes. We ideally have a way to minimize the counter space and actually have less space. So that's about AVANI, and I welcome you after this to see it here on the left. I'll be there also to speak to you about some questions that you have. Or maybe we can take some right now. I think somebody was...
In regards to your city structure, your concept, have you ever thought about setting up a prototype and perhaps this becomes a society or an environment that you could build on another planet? Has it gone that far?
That's a good one. So for your first part, thank you very much. I appreciate that. I think that it's something that is, you know, for me it's integrated with design. You know, design needs somewhat of a forecasting because you're always working towards the future. So if you're introducing a product in 2015, you're forecasting what the colors of 2015 will be and so forth and so forth. So if you're looking at a project of 20 years or 30 years, you know, you also have to kind of envision what happens then. In terms of different scale for this project, absolutely. In fact, something really interesting happened in the studio when we were rendering this project. We run some renderings overnight, and we did a mistake in the calculation of the scale of the trees. So what happened is we came in the morning and all of a sudden we saw that the scale of the trees were kind of like 1 to 1,000. So all of a sudden you have an island that is, you know, 1,000 times smaller than what this is. And it looks like maybe like 12 different houses, you know, in like a micro island in the Caribbean or something like that. And it looks so cute. And it looks so interesting. And I thought, wait a second, why can't we just even test it on that scale? So yes, I mean, if you have a client, let us know. We'll build it. And in terms of outer space, it's really not a joke. I was actually invited to speak at a design conference 2 months ago in Nebraska, and the talks were about designing the 22nd century. Now you're thinking 22nd century, that's way far away from now. I have a 1-year-old daughter, and I realized that she's going to be 86 in the 2020s. And I thought, well, that's not that far, actually. But there were so many amazing speakers part of that conference that spoke about societies in different planets and spoke about crazy things that, you know, who knows what we're going to work on in the next 75 years that I'm planning to practice. Thank you. Great. Thank you so much. Thank you.